As time goes on in the graphic arts, tastes change, words change, the meanings of words change. There's always been a feeling, with which I think we all concur, that photographs, when processed, never look quite the same as reality, and there seems to be something inadequate in what the camera captures. And everything we've always been trying to do throughout the industry is make it look a little bit more like reality. One of the things that was proposed maybe 10 years ago or a little bit more was a concept called HDR, a high dynamic range. Originally, it was explained as being trying to get a little bit more of a sense of depth in the lightest and darkest areas of the picture, making it seem more realistic. More realistic or less realistic, that depended upon your point of view. Because the first attempts at it, some of them looked very good, and some of them just looked like attempts to make a picture look ridiculous, make it look surrealistic. What I've always tried to do is do something along the lines of the first definition, that is to try and get more detail in a way that a viewer might conceivably accept as realistic. And I think that was the meaning up until about 5 years ago. Then it sort of changed to mean something totally surrealistic, featuring colors that nobody would ever possibly accept as being real. So whichever way you want to use it, the PPW, the picture postcard workflow, can accommodate you. If you want to make really bright, vivid colors, there isn't any difficulty. If you want to get a sense of depth, however, that always has been a problem. The original HDR idea was take two exposures, one a dark one, one a light one, somehow blend them together and hope that nobody notices. That's easier said than done. Also, in all but the most modern cases, this required that whatever the subject is does not move. Otherwise, you couldn't sync the two halves of the versions. I never thought it was necessary at all to have two exposures. You can usually do it with one. And I'd like to show the idea behind it as sort of an introduction to chapter 12. Not using an image that we're using here, and not using an image that we have in the book, and also not doing it even in the proper way, but just to show what the concept is, and especially why we have to blur our layer masks in a big way to make it work. So I'm going to show something that's really typical of the problems that we get in outdoor imagery, which is when we have really strong sunlight, then the camera picks up the shadows as being too deep and the highlights as being too bright, and it doesn't look quite natural. So let's see what we can do with this picture, which definitely displays that problem. Okay, here we are on the streets of Italy. You can forget normal HDR methods because obviously the people are moving, and so you would not be able to line the two exposures up. Okay, you can also forget about fixing this in a raw module of any kind because this one was shot as a JPEG, so you have what you have. Okay, I think we would agree that this is not what we would see if we were on the street. Yes, the colors are approximately correct, but the right side of the picture is lighter than what we would see. The dark half is darker than what we would see. Yes, we would observe that the left side is in shadow and the right side is in sun, but we would not see it as being that different. So how do we fix it? Let me add some layers here. 3 duplicate layers. On this first layer, I can make the highlights look a lot better. That's easy enough to do. There's my curve. Zap. Whole lot more highlight detail there. Pity about what happens to the left side of the image, but that's how it goes. Then on the next layer, I can do the opposite, which is make the left side of the image look good with a curve that does approximately the opposite thing. Unfortunately, it has the effect of blowing out the highlights on the right side, but the left side of the image now looks pretty good. So what do we have? There's the original. There's the version that has the highlights look good. There's the version that has the shadows look good. How do we combine these last two? Because although the shadows look good here, the light part looks stupid, and vice versa here. We've got decent light faces, but the dark half of the picture has been ruined. So we want to merge these two. How? Well, with a layer mask. Okay, so I'm going to add a layer mask here. And so what are we trying to accomplish? The lighter parts of this layer should be, or the darker part should be light in the layer mask because we want this part to show through. So I'm just going to load a copy of the RGB composite into the layer mask. And that's the wrong mode. Normal mode. And you'll see that's exactly the opposite of what I want to have happen because letting the light half of the third layer show through instead of the dark half. So the solution is to invert. Okay, so this is actually fairly interesting. Compare it to the original, and this fourth layer is a copy of the original. And something good is happening along with a whole bunch of baggage that we'd rather not know about. But in principle, we're seeing better faces on the right side of the image and also on the left side of the image. The problem is that something about this looks totally unnatural, that there seems like a total lack of contrast. For example, if you look at this lady's face here, there's the original, and something flattened it out terribly as a result of this process, even though the color is a little bit better, and even though the darkness is a little bit better. The solution here is kind of weird, which is go to the layer mask and blur it. Let's try something big like this. There's a blur of the layer mask. There's before the blur, and there's after the blur. And somehow, it seems to be adding contrast throughout the picture. There's before the blur, there's after. And something good is happening because let's look at the original without any of this blending and without any of this blurring. Right? We've managed to get a whole lot more action here on the left side of the picture without really losing contrast. So this has worked. Now why? Let me undo the blur. So that's the contrast-free version. Let's look at the layer mask. Option click. That's what the layer mask looks like. It's an inverted version of the RGB composite, which is to say it's more or less a grayscale version of the picture. And it's inverted so that things that are dark, like the hair over here, are actually light in the mask, which means it's going to allow this lighter part of the dark half to show through, if that makes any sense. The problem is that having these objects so well defined makes us lose contrast when things are only being lightened a little bit. Like we saw in this woman's face here, that when we did not blur, we lost a lot of detail. Why? Because this mask is causing the hair to get a lot lighter than the skin does, because the skin is so much darker in the mask than the hair is. So the hair and the skin come closer together. The result is a very flat looking face, like that. The solution is to go over here to the mask and kill that distinction. I did it with a Gaussian blur like this. Like that's the new mask. And you don't see any detail there, but that's what it looks like. And that's what permits the useful merge of these two channels. Now, we saw in chapter 11 that there are many ways of blurring beyond Gaussian blur, and they each have their uses. If you'd like to experiment, you can use different filters, or another possibility is cancel this, and now you can go to the properties window, properties palette, and you can blur the layer mask yourself. You can change its opacity if you wish, like that, and get a different effect. Or you can feather, which is a Gaussian blur, and get the same sort of result. Also, you don't have to look at the layer mask while you're doing it. You can look at the whole image, like that, and still do the same thing, which is choose the layer mask, and then choose the right radius. And you also have various things you can do with mask edges, or you can try reducing the opacity of the mask and see whether you like that. That doesn't look too bad. And then you wind up with something that you like, hopefully, and then compare it to the original, and you say, yeah, we can blend these two together. Now, as I mentioned when we started this little section, this isn't quite the right way to do it, but the result is actually pretty good. And so this can be a useful introduction to Chapter 12. The usual idea is, in Chapter 12, is lighten the image in a slightly more scientific way with a false profile or possibly with the exposure command, but to get some sort of result like this when we blend the two together. So hopefully this has been a good introduction to that.